You're a medical.
Sorry, just briefly before that, I just referenced the video is going to be recorded. I forgot to say, sorry. People don't want their faces on it. Please feel free just to remove your cameras. But sorry, Guy.
Not to worry. So what I want to do is to pose a question, which is whether we can successfully remedicalize the psychedelics. So I'm not attempting to cover everything that is to be said about psychedelics. I'm going to cover a particular aspect of it, which I think is I've come to think is important and which I'm particularly involved in. So how do we do this? Okay. So disclosures. I'm a psychiatrist. I've worked for many years as an academic psychiatrist in Oxford primarily. And I subsequently, following retirement, moved on to do other stuff. And most recently, I've joined Compass Pathways as Chief Medical Officer. So why did was I mad enough to come out of retirement? Well, it's simply because this is an extraordinary moment in time when I think, looking back over quite a long career, where as a student I knew about psychedelics, I'm now, as an old man, so to speak, coming to actually see some kind of return to normality for psychedelics, which I think is long overdue. So that's my sort of the arc of my personal story. But you must hear what I say, understanding that I have these potential conflicts of interest because of my particular background in advising pharma companies. So what I'd like to do is to, first of all, briefly give you a history, particularly of the Western experience of psychedelics, which is very specific and of course, very much conditioned by the origins of drugs, particular drugs in pharmaceutical companies. I want to talk a little bit about the original medical era, because it's not widely appreciated how extensive that was, how it went wrong, in my opinion, and now how we might be able to put it right so we can move back to the future, as I said in the title of this talk. So what about the history? Well, the history of LSD starts as an accidental discovery. Swiss scientist Albert Hofmann, who worked for Sandoz, was involved in deriving original new chemical entities, molecules, from extracts of ergot. And he was really seeking drugs that were useful in treating cardiovascular disorders. There was no intention whatsoever to produce a drug that acted on the brain. And he originally synthesized LSD in 1938. And he tested it out in various assays that they had at that stage. It didn't seem to be very useful. It didn't affect the cardiovascular system in the way that they hoped. It didn't seem to be of interest. And so he put it down. And for reasons that are not entirely clear, even to him, he had a strange premonition that this was an interesting compound. He was a chemist. He fell in love with molecules. And so in 1943, he resynthesized it. And he had a slightly odd experience during doing the synthesis, which led him then to take a dose of this medicine. And what he gave himself was 250 micrograms. And he calculated that was extremely low dose, which by most standards, most chemicals, it is, but it had a dramatic effect. And it's often commemorated as Bicycle Day in April the 19th every year. And it was the day of LSD's discovery. And Hofmann was the first person to take this drug and to have the experience that we now call the trip of LSD. And pretty dramatic it was. It certainly left an impact on him. And he discovered that he began to enjoy unprecedented visual shapes, hallucinations, fantastic images, alternating, variegated, colored. In a way, we heard all this, or maybe even experienced all this ourselves, and we kind of recognize this for what it is. But when this started, this was really a surprise to Hofmann. And it was accompanied by quite powerful emotional changes in that he felt exceedingly anxious and paranoid about what was going on around him. So the whole experience was a remarkable manifestation of his mind, an extraordinary sort of experience caused, you might note, by a very low dose of a drug. Now, to understand the context of this, bear in mind that the idea that the brain ran on chemicals was really not widely accepted in 1943. It was still an era when people argued about whether or not synaptic connections were electric devices rather than chemical devices. And the full acceptance of the chemical theory of synaptic transmission really didn't come until later on in the 1940s. So this was, in a way, a remarkable insight into brain chemistry. although it wasn't necessarily seen as such, it was nevertheless a remarkable thing that Hofmann discovered. And he was working for a company, and that company had a commercial interest, and it also wanted to see whether these drugs could be useful in any way for medicine. And their first thought was that it might be useful in psychiatry. Now, just to remind you, LSD is the structure on the right here. Serotonin hadn't actually been properly discovered. I mean, it was in the process of being discovered, but people didn't know it was in the brain in 1943. But it became clear from looking at the chemistry that you can see that LSD is a kind of makeshift extension of the serotonin molecule. And now we would not be transmissed that a drug with this structure would bind to receptors that are basically in nature designed to accommodate a transmitter like serotonin. So LSD was the first drug synthesized and discovered that binds to what we would now say were 5-HT2A receptors. And there are many classes now of 5-HT receptors that have been discovered, and they obviously weren't known at the time, but that seems to be the mechanism of action. And indeed, we can say that there are a whole range of hallucinogens that are active at 5-HT2A receptors. So LSD, if you can see on the left, DMT, desmoxytryptamine, and 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, psilocybin, mescaline. And LSD is the only one of them that is a pure kind of Western discovery. It's a Western synthesis. It is, so to speak, ours. The others belong to some extent to indigenous traditions where particular extracts of either roots or in the case of 5-methoxy-DMT, toad venom, mushrooms or cacti, all were found and discovered in history, prehistory, to give rise to these chemicals that are used to a variable degree in different societies as a part usually of religious ritual. Frequently with shamans who are specialists, if you like, as guides, either in taking the drug in sympathy with people, together with people, or in guiding people who've taken it. So this is what we know now, and there was certainly a certain amount known about these chemicals in the past at the time the LSD was discovered, but much less than we now know. In addition, just to notice, there are also drugs that are sometimes described as hallucinogenic, but are really dissociative in terms of the effects on the brain. They act at different receptors, particularly the NMDA receptor, and they include ketamine, phencyclidine, nitrous oxide. All drugs actually that have rather higher risk of abuse than do the 5-HT2A agonists. So that's a bit of pharmacology with a modern kind of update, but it wasn't obviously all known at the time that Sandoz released LSD, but release it they did. It was called Delicid, and if you can read this, which you probably can't, what this says is that the average initial dose is 25 micrograms. So they were advocating microgram dose, microdosing, if you like to come right up to date, which could be increased at each treatment until an optimum reaction is obtained. And so what they envisaged at that stage was that this essentially would be a way in which psychotherapists could facilitate contact for patients with unconscious promptings, urges, conflicts, and would be an aid to psychotherapy. And that was very much the kind of zeitgeist of psychiatry at the time. So psychiatry was very much divided at that stage into people really who looked after patients in asylum care with severe psychiatric illness on the one hand, and then patients with more neurotic disorders who were often looked after by general practitioners or counselors. And there weren't many of them. So it was regarded as an aid to the psychotherapy end of the psychiatric spectrum. And it was quite widely disseminated, but in those days, not heavily marketed. The numbers of people who were interested were quite limited, but there was very little regulation at the time. So that almost nothing prevented a doctor obtaining a supply of this directly from Sandoz, using it on his patients and seeing how it went. So those were very different days to what we have today. And it's quite important to understand that the world changed dramatically in the 60s, particularly following the problems with drugs that did have adverse effects and gave rise to limb malformations, of course, in the famous cases. So this is the history of LSD. It was used, therefore, as a mind-loosening device, a psycholytic. The leading figures in using the drug in this way, I've just indicated their names here, really saw it as an aid to talk therapy. And some famous people, I mean, I don't know whether Cary Grant is still famous. The old movie buffs among you will know who he is. And he was a film star who had 60 sessions of LSD. And it was a pretty good business model because the drug was pretty much made available cheaply. And the psychotherapy obviously was what was charged for. Now, on a serious note, people were trying to make use of this medicine in a sensible ways, and they wrote up their data as best they could without the benefits of modern precision, modern measurement, which is one of the few advances that psychiatry has been able to make in the last 50 years, is to agree on how to describe patient symptoms and how to measure them. But before that, people still tried to decide whether outcomes were good or bad. And the argument was that they saw good outcomes from this treatment. So outcomes for anxiety, 70% recovery, depression, 60%, obsessive compulsive disorder, 40%. Those were regarded as very promising at the time. And looking at the write-ups of the work, it's possible to see that clearly they were describing benefits which were real. But they didn't use methodology which are now useful to us. We would not regard what they did as properly controlled. There wasn't enough concern to whether you could have a fair comparison with a different treatment, a placebo, for example, or a low dose or whatever. And psychotherapy was rather unrestricted as well. They didn't specify what the ingredients of the psychotherapy were in a way that we would now want to do. So this was a kind of early start. It was quite promising, and it was going along fairly conventional medical lines. Together with this, there was a second development, if you like, which is the use of much higher doses, the kind of doses that Hofmann originally experienced, which produced what came to be called psychedelic experience. And psychedelic means mind manifesting. And it was really seen that mind manifesting drugs really produced very different, qualitatively different experiences, which very quickly became seen as having spiritual meaning, of leading people to reinterpreting their life and their experience in quite major ways. And the leading figures in this kind of treatment are named here. Humphrey Osmond was a British psychiatrist who, in fact, gave the doses of mescaline to Aldous Huxley, which allowed him to experience mescaline and to write very brilliantly about it. And those of you who haven't read of Aldous Huxley's book, The Doors of Perception, it really is worth a read. It's not too long, which is one of the great things about it, but it's a fantastic description of the psychedelic experience, which in his case was very positive and led to a lifelong interest from then on in its use in patients. And also, in a sense, in people seeking spiritual meaning. And that kind of thing influenced how it developed. And the use of these drugs required special precautions. And it was rapidly understood that in order for it to be safe, you needed to prepare people for what was going to happen. So they had to have the right set, and you had to really choose your setting. And your setting, was not midday in Piccadilly in central London. It was preferably a quiet place. In many ways, people often would converge on listening to music, to actually wearing eye shades, to focus inwardly, which is very much what we choose to do now. And the emphasis was on a transcendent experience. It wasn't really on a psychotherapy driven by or led by a psychological guide. It was really the patient who did the work. The person who was having the experience really was the person who drove what happened. And it's an inherently demedicalizing approach when you think about it. So the psychotherapists were very happy to augment their practice by using low doses of psychedelics. This approach, using a full dose, a large dose, was really at the time quite challenging. But it was not uncommon for patients to be offered this in a number of centers. It wasn't very widespread. So that's the sort of second way. And if you want to read a little bit more about the the characters involved in arguing about whether you should use low doses or high doses. So, the microdosing and the macrodosing is not a new controversy. Michael Pollan does a pretty good job of it in his book, which is How to Change Your Mind, which was published a couple of years ago and now in paperback. So if we summarize the medical use of hallucinogens, and particularly LSD, was that Sandoz supplied lots of people with this drug. Probably 40,000 patients were treated, and very characteristic of early medical discoveries, people published a ridiculous number of publications, given the number of patients who were actually being treated. And it was a part of practice which could have developed in the 1960s. It didn't develop because basically the recreational use of the drug became so prominent, and the calls came for it to be used as a way of transforming society. So if you like, the use of the drug as an epiphany, a moment to produce epiphany, to produce major change in individuals, was kind of translated as a means of transforming society. And one of the people who was sort of most associated with that, and in my youth was kind of forever on television proselytizing about this, was Timothy Leary. Leary was a psychologist at Harvard initially. He did one of the earliest controlled experiments with LSD when he took a group of religious studies students and brought them into a chapel on Good Friday and gave half of them LSD and half of them placebo. And it soon became pretty clear who'd got the placebo. And he basically documented the experiences and the differences in the experience that these people had. So this was an initial approach to be scientific about it, but Leary really fell in love with the idea that this could change society. And he became an evangelist, and he asked interesting questions like, is there a life after youth? To which I can say, actually, yes, there probably is actually. So Leary was a big mover, but it had major consequences. And the consequences were the widespread uptake of the use of LSD. It was synthesized sort of on a black market basis, not obviously by companies, but by individuals in their garages. It wasn't particularly difficult to make. It didn't produce any major poisoning episodes, but clearly it was taken up, particularly by young people, and particularly by young people in rebellion against the conventions of the 1950s. America was a very conventional place. And in particular, the Vietnam War and the fact that they were getting drafted to die in Vietnam. And it's worth remembering over 200,000 young men died in Vietnam. And it was a huge issue in the 1960s into the 1970s, which divided American society and created schisms that have not really gone away, and in fact are getting worse in some ways. So the abandonment of the project by serious scientists occurred for three reasons, really. The first of all, that this evangelism was pretty unattractive to sober people who wanted to be taken seriously. It secondly demedicalized, and really it began to look ridiculous to talk about treating patients when really what was happening was that people were taking these drugs in very uncontrolled circumstances, at raves, at parties, at music festivals. They were getting into a lot of trouble. People were ending up in emergency rooms, having psychotic breakdowns. It became, the bad outcomes became much more obvious than any good that it was doing. And it was therefore kind of the next step was the moral panic that led the US government to declare what came to be known as the war on drugs, which unfortunately is still with us in various forms. And LSD and related drugs were among the first to be put on the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 as Schedule I agents. And as you can see here, by definition, that meant they had no accepted medical use, a lack of accepted safety, and a high abuse potential. And medications within this schedule may not be prescribed, dispensed, or administered for medical use. And what the Americans did first was very rapidly followed by most of the other countries in the rest of the world who had treaties with the Americans. So this was pretty much a blanket shutdown. I have to say that, in fact, the medical profession and pharmacologists had largely lost interest in LSD, and by that stage anyway, just for the reasons I gave earlier. But this was the coup de grace, really. So that from 1970, really for 40 years, so that's effectively 2 or 3 generations of PhDs and MDs who might have been interested in using these drugs, simply had no access to them. And the only access people did have was essentially illegal. Now, that didn't mean there wasn't interest in these drugs, but that was essentially completely underground, and medicine as such fell out of it. So the underground era was not without innovation. And one of the most interesting of the innovators was a guy called Sasha Shulgin. He was a chemist for the Dow Chemical Corporation. He invented one of the first biodegradable pesticides. And for that, he was regarded with a remarkable degree of professional freedom by the Dow company to sort of do what he wanted. And what he wanted was to pioneer syntheses around the ring that I showed you earlier, which mimics serotonin and other monoamines. And he basically pioneered the synthesis of an awful lot of these compounds that we are still quite interested in today. And if you want to learn more about him, because he was an interesting and colorful figure, as was his wife, there's a film called Dirty Pictures, which you can see on Netflix. Or if you still read books, then you can go to PCAL, which is he called a chemical love story, where he gives a kind of first-hand account of how he went about developing understanding of the drugs that he synthesized. And that was basically through weekend parties where he invited friends like mine who would sample the drug he kind of created that week, and they would compare notes on the effects. And he's credited with having discovered and synthesized over 200 compounds with psychoactive properties, and he dutifully documented the effects on perception, emotion, sexual pleasure, the whole range, if you like, and usually compared notes with his wife. So it was a kind of unconventional, you might say, approach to drug development, but it went on, and he in particular developed MDMA or ecstasy, the synthesis for that. And it was initially used also as an aid to psychotherapy, but then also was rapidly taken up by the rave movement and used in nightclubs a lot. So those drugs created their own mini versions of the moral panic we'd seen earlier with LSD. So things changed a bit in the 2000s, and pharmacologists started to say, why did we give up on these drugs so early? Why, when now we have much better tools, we can ask more interesting questions. We can use imaging technology to look at what these drugs do in the brain. Why aren't we taking more interest in them? Because they've been out of reach and they've been out of mind, but maybe they should be looked at again. And this sort of plea to end the war on research bans, as it were, was made in about 2014, by which time several groups had obtained permission to give these drugs again to human volunteers in well-controlled experiments. And the whole bandwagon that we have now started to roll very slowly at first, but with increasing momentum since. Now, the way in which this is being developed is along the traditional ways, the low dose and the high dose, the low road and the high road, if you like. And the new psycholytic therapy is essentially been pushed by an organization called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Research and Therapy. And their approach has been to look for the legalization of MDMA as psychotherapy, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. And this has been driven, as many things that have to be, by one committed individual, and that's Rick Doblin. And Rick is shown in his CEO-looking appearance in the top picture, and and his true spirit is underneath, where he's sitting next to Albert Hofmann. And Rick has, for 30 years, has developed this movement, which is not for profit, which basically has raised money from wealthy individuals to try and introduce this treatment for wider use, particularly in combat veterans. Now, what is this therapy? Well, it consists of, this is shown in this multicolored timeline. There are 3 administrations at times 1, time 2, and time 3 of MDMA or placebo. So this is a clinical trial, which is, it's important that these should be done systematically to prove that these drugs really do work. But this obviously, because it involves a new experience for the patient, requires preparation, which is shown in this light blue color. It then involves the session itself. It then involves an integration afterwards, shown in purple. And that's a second integration some days later. So each of these bands represent time invested with the therapist over an 18-week period. So there's a lot of time involved here, as well as the drug experience. And the trial has value because the drug experience is compared with the placebo experience at times 1, 2, or 3. And there's randomization to what you get, whether you get the drug or whether you get the placebo, but everyone gets the psychological support stroke treatment. And this was published in Nature Medicine last year, and this shows the results. And basically, the colors are a little strange, but if you look on the 3 pillars on the left, this is the placebo response after 1, 2, and 3 sessions. And you can see that the number of patients who are in remission is pretty much negligible. And the number who've significantly reduced the symptoms is not particularly great, goes up to about 25%. But obviously, there's not much of a response in the placebo group to the psychotherapy alone. Whereas if you look at the MDMA-assisted group, you can see that almost 30% are now in remission, and another 30% are really much reduced symptoms. Now, this isn't, 100. This isn't a magic bullet. It's not 100%, but this is a disorder, severe PTSD, with very little alternative treatments, and as you can see, a pretty ineffective result from psychotherapy. So the fact that this trial, which may well have minimized effects rather than magnified them, this trial can show these benefits is an impressive start in saying that we can use an example of a psychedelic drug, because most people regard MDMA as related anyway. It's not, doesn't work in quite the same way, but it's certainly psychedelic in some senses, but it certainly has effects on the psychotherapy experience. Now, echoing the psycholytic psychedelic split, the new psychedelic therapy has been pioneered by 2 groups, really. Johns Hopkins with Roland Griffiths, who's shown on the left here, and Imperial College London on the right, with Robin Carhart Harris, David Nutt, and Amanda Fielding. Amanda's an eccentric woman who's supported the use of psychedelics for a very long time, since the early 60s, and has finally seen her dreams of seeing these drugs used come to fruition, which is kind of remarkable. What have they done? Well, this was the Hopkins study. This is psilocybin in treating depression and anxiety in cancer patients. This is 51 patients. So this is, by medical standards, a small study. It was double blind, but it was crossover, and crossover studies, again, are a little tricky. But what you get basically was either a low dose psilocybin, which was 1 or 3 milligrams, or high dose psilocybin, 22 to 30 milligrams. And basically, you either got the low dose first or the high dose first, and then people who got the low dose got on their second go a high dose. But they basically compared the low dose and the high dose. And what you can see in the graphs on the right is that the number of participants showing clinically significant response or clinically significant remission is much greater in the group given the high dose. And in terms of response, it's as high as 80% showing a response. And that's very high by the standards of depression trials. And you get similarly high effects for anxiety. So depression and anxiety usually scale together. That's not really a surprise, but it's very, very striking that this is quite as big an effect as it is. And it kind of harks back to the figures I gave you earlier about 70% responses in the early studies in the 1950s with patients with anxiety disorders. So this was the first finding in the new era that we had an effective treatment for depression. And what's the mechanism? Well, what they were able to show is that if you look at the lower graphs here, the anxiety scores fell as a function of the total intensity of the experience, which they call mystical, and have emphasized the spiritual significance side of things. You could also emphasize particular elements of connectedness that patients experience, not necessarily mystical, but a sense of connectedness, which seems to be very important and correlate with the outcome, as you can see, both in the case of anxiety and in the case, to a weaker extent, of depression in the right-hand graph. So we seem to have an effect which is driven by the peak experience during the drug, which is statistically significant and promising for good patient outcomes. And the question is, should this be moved into immediate treatment? Now, the people who did these studies, I think rather naively thought that the FDA, the regulatory bodies in the States, would jump at this data and say, oh, wonderful, you know, we'll make this available for everyone who suffers from anxiety, depression related to cancer, which would be quite a lot of people. But that really isn't the way it works. That's not really an indication as understood by the FDA. This kind of trial is simply done in too informal a way to be accepted. The people doing the ratings weren't adequately blinded. The patients themselves probably could detect the difference between the treatments that they got. They knew that they would get a treatment, which is kind of part of the crossover design. And so there are a variety of ways in which this would be regarded as not a fair test of the drug in a more strict regulatory environment, which is the one that actually exists. So the route to remedicalization has got to be through a conventional pathway. And what I'd like to say is that basically the route to legalization is regulation. And if you go through the regulatory route, then you have to choose a conventional regulatory target. And there are a number of possible ones. You've heard about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is the MAPS process going towards. I'm interested in treatment-resistant depression. I've long been interested in mood disorders, and that seems to me one of the obvious places to try and start because of the enormous unmet need. I mean, as many as 1/3 of patients who are treated for depression, be it with antidepressants or with psychotherapy, end up with a pretty poor outcome. They have difficult to treat conditions, and they're not well treated by the present services of the NHS, or indeed in less regulated environments like the US one. So how are we going to go about transforming healthcare for these people? This is a corporate slide for which I make no apologies, because I work for these people, and I want to explain what we're trying to do. We're following the treatment-resistant depression pathway. The reasons are summarized here. This is a big area of unmet medical need. These are very costly. It's a very costly disorder, so that the possibility that one gets reimbursed for these treatments, which is very important for patient access, is much higher if you have an expensive condition than if you have an inexpensive one. This is unfortunately the simple truth about health economics. So this is a target where we have a hope of getting reimbursement for a treatment and therefore making access general. What is it that we're offering the patient? Well, it's two things. First of all, it's crystalline psilocybin. Psilocybin is present in mushrooms of the Psilocybin genus. It's a chemical which in fact was never registered by Sandoz, who originally synthesized it. So we have a patent because there is a novel chemical preparation and crystalline form. That gives us the freedom to operate, if you like, with some sort of patent protection. But the drug can only really be given under safe conditions, and those safe conditions are guaranteed by psychological support. And that psychological support entails preparation for what might happen in the study, in the experience of psilocybin, support during the experience, so that while people have come to a quiet and well-appointed room, They are supported by someone who stays with them throughout the time that they're under the influence of the drug. And then in the following week or so, patients are seen again to allow them to integrate and clarify things that have happened to them on the day of the dosing. So that is, we think, the minimum that is necessary to guarantee safety for patients who undergo this treatment. And bear in mind, a regulated medicine has to be proved to be efficacious and safe. And this is the way we think it can be made safe. So the major study that we've just recently reported, we haven't yet published in a peer-reviewed journal, so you're getting a sneak peek at the findings are summarized on this slide. All patients were discontinued from their current antidepressants. All of them had failed to respond to at least 2 treatments. 93% of the patients were psychedelic naive. So you can see it was very important to get the preparation right for these people. This study was done in centers that were not psychedelic centers of speciality. So these were conventional psychiatric services, and the patients came to them through rather conventional routes. And that hadn't been true of many of the previous smaller scale studies completed by academic centers. The patients were randomized to receive either 1, 10, or 25 milligrams of COMP360, which is the crystalline version of psilocybin I described a moment ago. And then they had that on day 1, and then they were followed up subsequent days for 12 weeks to see how they did on this treatment. And bear in mind, these are quite difficult patients to treat. We pre-specified the week 3 time point as being the point at which we would look for a change in the primary outcome. Those of you who are interested in clinical trials will know that it's very important to pre-specify and not to sort of p-hack and go after significance at different time points in a trial of this kind. So the results are summarized here. When you do a trial like this, you do it blind, so that these ratings were all done by remote assessors who didn't know even the trial that the patients were in. All they knew was that they had to have a rating scale conducted by interview. And the rating scale really asks about the major symptoms of depression. And what you can see is that there's a big change from baseline at 0, and the change at day 2, day 3, week 1, week 3, week 6. You can see there's a statistically significant difference between the 25 milligram and the 1 milligram. And those of you who are pharmacological aficionados will note immediately that there's a dose-response relationship, which is present at day 2, at week 1, week 3, and so on. Now, things change a bit towards the end of the study because we couldn't keep people drug-free, so other things started happening beyond week 3 and onto week 6, other treatments, various forms of support for patients who were not doing very well. So we're confident about these results up to about week 6. And you can see that there's an important benefit for the 25 dose compared to both the other 2. So this trial has allowed us to say that 25 milligrams is probably the lowest effective dose. The drug behaves like a drug. It has a dose effect relationship, which is really important. The psychological support, broadly speaking, kept people safe, although there's always a risk in these studies that you get increased suicidality. And when patients don't respond and they know they've had an effective treatment, you can imagine that that creates a lot of disappointment and distress, which again is going to be something we have to be careful about. Now, you saw a drift up in those numbers, so that patients tend to, the initial benefit tends to wear off a little bit in a lot of people, but in some people it's really very well maintained. And you can see in this particular graph that about a quarter of the people on the 25 milligram dose remained drug-free and in basically remission of symptoms at week 12 in this trial. And we know from other studies that people who remain well at 12 weeks tend to remain well for much longer than that. So we're following these patients up to see just how well they do in the long run. So this is the beginnings of quite a long road to subsequent regulatory approval. We have the capital within the company to run what is called a phase 3 study. This was a phase 2. This establishes the dose we should test. The phase 3 will answer a few other questions, and it will be at that point that we will go to the regulatory authorities in the United States and in Europe and say, look, psilocybin is an effective and safe treatment for treatment-resistant depression. We would like to have access to markets and offer it to patients through healthcare systems. And that will be the point at which we have legal access for patients to psilocybin. The earliest that's likely to be is in 2024. And then we have the whole challenge of scaling up the provision of these services, and particularly the psychological support, which we think is so important. So I won't dwell on the secondary endpoints, but these just emphasize that the quality of the recovery in these patients is very, very striking. So they return to having minimal depressive symptoms and a good quality of life, which is exactly what you would want to see for people. And these people have taken a single dose of psilocybin and they're no longer taking any antidepressants. The adverse events that we carefully collect, this simply shows you that the physical adverse effects like headache, nausea, fatigue are weakly related to the 25 milligram dose. So this experience isn't free of adverse effects. But the thing we're particularly concerned about is suicidality. And you can see suicidal ideation, which we ask at every visit that the patient makes, we ask them about it, runs at about between 5 and 7%. And so that's always going to be a real concern in these studies. And some of the more serious of the suicidal developments occurred in the higher dose arm. So we're going to have to look at that very carefully in the future when we have larger numbers, because at the moment, even though this is the largest study that's ever been done in this area, it's still not large by the standards that we need to convince regulators that we have a good treatment. So I'll stop at that point. I hope I've illustrated briefly anyway how the hallucinogens arose in Western medicine, what they were used for, how they were used either in the psycholytic or the psychedelic way. That original medical era was quite promising, but it never really got fully started, and it preceded the more scientific approaches to psychiatry that followed in the 1980s and beyond. And it went wrong really because of widespread recreational use, which I don't think is very safe, particularly safe with these medicines. So we're now trying to remedicalize it, to try and produce it so that it's useful to patients with real need. And the challenge will be to get this right in the next few years. I'm confident that it's possible, but there will continue to be challenges. And that's because there's an environment in which all this is taking place. And I've tried to summarize it on this slide. And I'm not going to take sides. We've got to decide where we want to be on this particular grid. On the left-hand side is kind of where we are now, which is that in most places these drugs are illegal. The regulation is really down to whether the police enforce the law, which they commonly don't. So there is no regulation of the use of these drugs, but they're not very available. And the leadership tends to be criminals, and certainly in some drugs, particularly the more addictive ones, it's always criminals. There's a ritual and traditional use in some societies. Obviously, that's linked to religion, and the leadership of the kind of use of the drugs tends to be a priesthood. Some people are very impressed by this approach and would like to see us kind of return to a more indigenous way of life. So they favor this kind of approach to the use of these drugs. The medical one I've tried to describe to you, where I think the prescriber, the leadership is likely to be psychiatrists, could be GPs, but I don't think they will want that in the early stages of this. And then finally, there could be a recreational development. There could be approval for recreational use, where I think I would argue that the leadership will really pass to Hollywood. So you pay your money and you take your choice. My own choice would be for us to follow the conventional drug model route, simply because I think it will benefit people who really need these medications, and they really need them now. We've got a bit of a crisis in mental health care. We could do with a reboot, we could do with doing things better. And so these drugs are not only probably useful in themselves, but I think they will inspire a new generation of doctors to think more creatively about how they treat their patients. And that, I think, can only be a good thing. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Guy. That was fascinating. Yeah, I suppose in regards to questions, either unmute yourself or feel free to drop them in the chat if anyone has any questions. Yeah. Otherwise, we will take off. You got one in the chat there if you can see that, Guy.
Okay, is LSD safe for asthmatic people? As far as I know, it is. I don't know of any reports that that LSD would produce asthmatic attacks. Obviously, all worth looking that up. But off the top of my head, I don't think, and we certainly haven't. We have the similar action, pharmacological action. We certainly haven't had any reports in our data set of bronchospasm from using these drugs.
Right. Well, if anyone has a question, is currently typing, will you please let me know? Oh, never mind, you got one in there.
Okay, so this is recreational use of psilocybin is now legal in a couple of states in the USA. And the safety of this is backed up by David Nutt's assessment. Yeah, yeah, there are a couple of comments really. I mean, one of the states is Oregon, and I'm most familiar about Oregon than anywhere else. I mean, Oregon has chosen to initiate a process which is actually going to take 2 years to make a decision on whether they should move to a kind of, as you say, a legal use. It's unclear really what the indications will be for the use of psilocybin. I think you could argue that there will be winners and losers from that. It's not clear to me that this could happen within a healthcare system. So it will be a kind of, it will be provided by therapists who are outside the healthcare system. It means it'll cost people money, I suspect. It won't be reimbursable because health insurance won't cover it. So yes, it will be free, free in legal sense, but it certainly won't be free. It will be freedom also to make money, which people I suspect will do. David Nutt's comments on it are, I think, probably related to the fact that he makes the general point, and he's an old friend of mine who I respect a great deal. He makes a general point that when you look at the harms of drugs, it's ridiculous to have legal barriers against drugs like psilocybin and LSD when we have so little barrier against alcohol. I suppose my concern about that slightly is that we've had very, very strict controls on the psychedelics for many years. And in the 1960s, there's quite a lot of evidence that they were pretty unsafe in the way that they were used. They were used without regard to set and setting. I think David's obviously saying that if you did it within set and setting, they would be likely to be safe. And I think I agree with him. But it would be good, I think, to see that proved in proper studies rather than simply asserted on the basis of very small studies, which is what we have at the moment. And indeed, the Oregon group who are looking at this have already summarized the evidence and concluded that there is very little evidence for safety and efficacy. So, you know, you kind of come back to the fact that if you want to recommend this as an effective and safe thing for people to do, you do actually have to do the research that proves that point. And it was never done properly in the early days. It can only be done now by spending a lot of money. And basically you have to decide who's going to spend that money. The model that we're proposing is simply that we get that money from investors and we make it back through reimbursement, whatever. Basically at the end, somebody has to pay for the safety and the efficacy that we take for granted. And you know, the model that we have is we're trying to do it through a private enterprise model. Thank you for the talk. So this is Ry Render. Hello, thank you for the talk. Non-psychoactive analogs. Yeah, so I think this is a really interesting question that the way in which these drugs bind to the 5-HT2A receptor, we know produces a cascade of pharmacological effects, quite apart from the psychedelic effects. And so there is a real question as to whether those pharmacological effects are what is relevant to the antidepressant actions. And there's quite a lot of interest in seeing whether you can get those downstream effects on gene expression without actually having the psychedelic effects that are so characteristic of the acute effect of the drug. So when the drug is on board, you see the psychedelic effect. When the drug is gone, you continue to see enduring effects on neural function. So whether those are strictly dissociable is of great interest. And it does seem possible, but at the moment, we don't quite know how it's going to work. What has to happen for stage 3 trials to go ahead? Yeah, well, that's a great question. There's a pretty straightforward process, at least to describe, if not to actually execute. Basically, any company who has done the sort of study we have done has to produce a very detailed summary of the study itself and also of the pharmacological properties of the medicine. This has to be submitted to the regulatory authorities, which in the States is the FDA. The FDA will then really, in confidence, will assess this dossier and then will feed back on recommendations for the subsequent development. And they can either say, go ahead, things are okay, or they can say, we think you need to do a bit more here or a bit more there. Assuming they say that you can go ahead, then the phase 3 process can start, and the necessary funds that you need to spend on the next trial can go ahead. We're at a stage where we're yet to speak to the FDA, and after we've done so, we will be able to announce the details of the clinical trials, and then we'll be actually get on with doing them, we hope. But for the moment, we're waiting on the decision of others. So that's what regulation means. It means actually, allowing the medical authorities in the United States and elsewhere to sit in judgment on what we're doing, to admit, to give them as much of the information as they need to reach the decision that they've got to reach, and to be completely transparent about the way that we're doing the studies. And that's what you have to do, I think, to underscore and prove that what you're doing is safe and effective. My 25-year-old daughter is functional. Yeah. I wouldn't really like to speculate on an individual person's experience. We have an interest in functional neurological disorder, and people, not me personally, but the colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry who are interested in this application, and indeed would like to do studies with psilocybin in functional neurological disorders. I think that's a development which unfortunately we'll have to be patient and wait for. I appreciate very, very much that for patients, this waiting seems interminable. And I wish that we could do these studies quicker, but unfortunately, we really are obliged to follow the rules, and the rules are pretty strict. But be assured that certainly this is on the radar, and we're very interested in this application. And I think it might be the case that in some indications, we may get faster approval simply because there are no alternatives or very unsatisfactory alternatives. In the case of depression, that isn't the case, so we'll have to take a very long route, but it will be worth taking because it will establish the principle that these medicines can be used by doctors safely.
Okay, thank you.
Not at all. So Tom Cooney, are you aware of any other emerging treatments that have the potential probably use? Well, I mean, people have been very interested by the use of ketamine, which isn't normally classified as a psychedelic because it basically is used really to produce neural effects rather than psychological effects. I think what is unusual about the psychedelics is that they seem to offer two kinds of effect. One is on the underlying brain changes that we know occur, which might be relevant to antidepressant effects. And they also produce this experience that people subjectively have as and feel to be add special meaning to their lives and give them a new sort of sense of direction. And that seems to be down to what actually happens in the session. The same claim isn't really made for ketamine, although it's starting to attract interest from that respect. But ketamine and related treatments are of considerable interest, and they are actually much more available, albeit limited in the UK by NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence. But they are available in other countries, and particularly in the United States. So that has been the big other alternative. The difference from conventional treatments, both ketamine and psilocybin appear to be very fast-acting treatments, whereas the traditional antidepressants may take weeks to see benefits. And obviously that's quite paradigm changing if you know immediately whether something has worked rather than having to wait for weeks to see whether it will. So yeah, that's in a nutshell is what I would say to that. Where are we? Sorry, I have to read this. When you're talking to college, you're working, so how much does political keep their opinions? Well, it's a good question. I mean, most of the people whose opinion I really have been seeking recently are the people who actually were the investigators in our clinical trial. And they work in about 20 centers across the world. I've been talking to each one of them systematically, going through their experiences, getting their reactions. All of them are really very excited. Of course, they come from essentially a medical psychiatric background. So they see this as a big thing for psychiatry, as something that could really change the way we work. So they're excited by it. They've seen very good results in their own patients. So that makes them enthusiastic. The political aspects of this obviously aren't the first thing we talk about. But there's certainly a political environment in which what we're doing is seen as being, well, it's seen from a variety of perspectives. I think there's a sort of utopian view that somehow one shouldn't be able to make money out of plants and other sort of extracts, although we don't actually harm mushrooms, we synthesize this drug. But, the idea that somehow this should not be something that is done. That's sometimes linked to the view that these are truly the inventions of indigenous communities and that this is kind of stealing their knowledge. And that's also an issue that is stated to be a reason for not liking what we're doing. I think in other cases, it's simply that people would like to be competitive in a different way. So, there's a range of ways in which things get political. I'm personally reluctant to get into the political fight. We think that the route to legalization for us is regulation, and we don't want to tell other people what to think. This is the issues around legalization are political, and they should be settled by society. And we get enough told what to do without my company joining in and telling you what to think. We know what we're trying to do. We've been very transparent about it, and we think that it will work. If other ways work better, then so be it. So if the results from stage 3 trials are very positive, do you think the presentation of the stimulated regulated bodies will be sufficient to bring about rescheduling? If not, yeah, I mean, in fact, if the FDA approve this, then it's automatically rescheduled, actually. Because as you see, the definition of a Schedule 1 drug is that it has no medical application. As soon as the FDA recognizes that it has efficacy and safety in an indication, then it is effectively it's re-categorized. So that isn't likely to be the barrier. I mean, of course, there may be there may be hiccups in the interpretation of the phase 3 data. We can't say. But assuming all goes well, we would hope that the rescheduling would be an automatic thing. There have also, of course, been vague promises in this country to reschedule. It wouldn't make a great deal of difference, except that it would make it slightly easier for researchers to to hold the drug in pharmacies and not have to pay a lot of money for reinforced doors and so on. So it would make a minor difference, but it wouldn't really make a major. Rescheduling alone wouldn't make much of a difference to the availability for clinical use.
In regards to John, the question about if the recording is available, I can take that one. Yes, it will be. It will be uploaded onto our YouTube channel, hopefully over the next coming days. I will put a link to it on the Facebook group, on the Facebook event page in a couple of days, if you just kind of keep your eye on that. That one there.
Thank you.
Awesome. And that's all the questions then. Just again, a massive thank you, Guy, for coming in, for talking to us. It's been really, really insightful. Yeah, that's about all. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Have a good